They lied to us. They said capture meant degradation, that the Americans were no better than beasts. But what happens when the enemy offers you hot water and real soap? Texas, 1,944. The air shimmered with oppressive heat, rising off the barbed wire fences that circled the camp like a menacing mirage. Beyond the gates, the land stretched endlessly. Mesquite trees, dust, and the heavy silence of noon. Inside, a line of German women stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces hollowed by the ordeal of travel and the cold grip of fear. Some were officers' wives, others nurses or secretaries captured with retreating troops. Their uniforms were gone, replaced with plain khaki issued by the U.S. Army. A young American guard stepped forward, clipboard in hand. He called out, his voice calm but firm. "All prisoners, report to the showers." The line stiffened instantly. A ripple of raw, visceral tension passed through them. The word hit like a shockwave. Showers. The silence deepened. No one breathed. One woman whispered in German, trembling, "Not here, too." Another bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. They had heard the unspeakable stories. Rumors whispered in trains and barracks across Europe. Prisoners sent to showers and never seen again. For months they had prayed never to hear that word again. The guard noticed their hesitation but couldn't comprehend the source of their terror. "Come on, ma'am," he said gently, motioning toward a long wooden building. "Just a wash, hot water, real soap. It's been a long trip." The women didn't move. Fear had frozen them in place. One, a nurse named Frau Liesl Müller, stepped back and clutched the small silver cross around her neck. Her voice was barely audible. "They lied to us. They said Americans were no better." The Texan sergeant overseeing the line frowned, genuinely puzzled by their extreme terror. Slowly he took off his hat, wiped his brow, and spoke softly. "Ain't no tricks here, ma'am. You'll feel better after. Trust me." No one answered. The guards exchanged worried glances but stayed silent. The tension was unbearable, thick with unspoken horror. Finally, one woman, older, her face streaked with sweat, stepped forward. She whispered, "If it is death, at least it will be clean." She walked toward the building. The others followed, trembling, their boots crunching on the dry gravel. Inside, they found rows of metal pipes, steam rising from dripping shower heads. The smell of soap and hot iron filled the air. When the first woman, the brave one, pulled the chain, a sudden rush of water burst out. Warm, clear, real. Gasps echoed through the room. Someone sobbed. Another laughed hysterically through tears. The crippling terror collapsed instantly into stunned disbelief. Frau Müller tilted her face up into the spray, her hands shaking violently. For the first time in years, she felt the heat of clean water. Not rain, not mud, but pure human comfort. She whispered to herself, "It smells like home." Outside, the Texan sergeant leaned on the doorway, watching the steam rise, utterly unaware that inside, a dozen prisoners were crying, not from pain, but from the unbearable shock of being treated as human again. The sound of water filled the wooden structure, soft, steady, unreal. For the German women inside, each drop felt like a question. Is it safe? Is this really happening? They moved slowly beneath the falling water, as if afraid it might suddenly stop and reveal the truth was only a cruel dream. Steam clouded the air, blurring the rigid lines between them. Some stood frozen, still half expecting something terrible to happen. Others started to breathe again, their hands shaking as they reached for the coarse brown soap left on a shelf. One of them whispered, almost laughing through tears, "It's real. It's just water." Frau Müller pressed her palms to her face, the warmth flooding her senses. For months, she'd lived in dirt and cold, her skin carrying the heavy weight of war. Now the water ran over her scars, her hair, her deepest fears. She could smell the faint sweetness of soap, something she hadn't smelled since before Berlin burned. A guard opened the door slightly, calling out in English, 10 minutes, ladies." His tone wasn't harsh, just procedural, but the women flinched instantly at his voice. They didn't understand the words, only the authority behind them. One woman, younger, misunderstood and started crying again. Frau Müller stepped forward. Her English, broken, but clear. He said, 10 minutes. Only time, not danger. The woman nodded, trembling, and let the water hit her face. The misunderstanding lingered like a ghost, the kind that only language can create. To the Americans, a shower was hygiene. To these women, it was a memory, a symbol twisted by the cruelty they had witnessed back home. When the time was up, they stepped out slowly, wrapped in rough towels that smelled faintly of bleach. Their eyes darted around, searching for soldiers, punishment, or humiliation, but none came. Instead, the same Texan sergeant who'd called them out earlier was waiting by the door, arms crossed, hat in hand. He looked them over, not with pity, but with the quiet patience of someone who's seen too much war. "Feel better?" he asked simply. No one answered, but the older woman who had stepped forward first nodded slightly. She whispered something in German, too soft for him to understand, but Frau Müller translated. She says, "It is the first time we have been clean." The sergeant nodded once, then tipped his hat before walking off into the sunlight. Behind him, the women stood in silence, dripping water onto the dusty ground, trying to understand what just happened. For the first time since capture, they realized they were alive, and that life, even here, might still mean something more than mere survival. That night, the camp was quiet. The Texas wind hummed eerily through the wires, and the moon painted long silver bars on the dirt floor of the women's barracks. Inside, Liesl sat on her bunk, her hair still damp from the shower. She held a small notebook in her lap, its pages creased from being hidden in her clothes since capture. For the first time in months, her hands were clean enough to write. She began carefully, in the neat handwriting of a nurse. Texas. Warm water. Real soap. No shouting. She paused, the pen trembling slightly, and then added, "They treat us like people." Around her, the others whispered softly, unable to sleep. One woman hummed a lullaby from home. Another stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, lost somewhere between disbelief and exhaustion. They were all trying to make sense of the same impossible truth. The enemy had washed their fear away with kindness. As Liesl wrote, her mind drifted back to Berlin, 1943. She remembered the hospital corridors echoing with screams, the suffocating smell of blood and smoke. She remembered the radio voices, the grandiose speeches, the slogans that told them Germany would rule forever. She remembered her fiancé, an SS officer, sending letters full of promises and cruel lies. And then one day, the letters stopped coming altogether. She'd volunteered for medical duty afterward, patching up shattered soldiers until her hands blistered, until she couldn't tell where the dirt ended and the blood began. When the Americans captured her convoy near the Rhine, she'd prepared to die. Instead, they gave her food. Now, they gave her water. Her bunkmate, Helga, broke the silence. "Why do they do this?" she whispered. "We bombed their cities. We killed their men. And they give us soap." Frau Müller shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Maybe it's to shame us. Or maybe," she hesitated, searching desperately for the words, "maybe they just don't hate like we were taught to." Helga turned away, pulling her blanket tight, unable to process the thought. But Liesl kept writing. Each word felt heavier than the last. If our officers saw this, they would call it weakness. But maybe this is what strength looks like. Outside, a guard walked past with a flashlight, his boots crunching in the gravel. The beam of light briefly passed over the window, catching the women's faces, tired, uncertain, human. Liesl set down her pen and whispered a prayer she hadn't said since before the war. "If this is defeat," she said softly, "then maybe defeat is not the worst thing." She lay back and closed her eyes. The sound of running water still echoed in her memory, not a nightmare, but something gentler, something new. For the first time in years, she dreamt not of fire or marching boots, but of rain falling softly on clean skin. Weeks passed. The camp settled into a predictable rhythm. Roll calls at sunrise, labor in the gardens, lessons in English for those who asked. Life became routine. Yet under that calm surface, something deeper began to change. The women started to see the strange arithmetic of their captivity. The numbers that didn't make sense to soldiers raised on the Reich's math of domination. Liesl helped in the infirmary, sorting medicine bottles under the supervision of an American nurse. On a bulletin board near the entrance, a newspaper clipping caught her eye. She stopped and read. It was an article from the Dallas Morning News, dated May 1944. United States spends $1.8 billion housing Axis POWs humanely. $1.8 billion, a number that utterly crushed her breath. She ran her finger under the lines, reading the figures twice to be sure. Next to it, another chilling statistic. Each prisoner receives 3,000 calories a day, access to medical care, mail, and recreation in accordance with the Geneva Convention. 3,000 calories. In Germany, her mother had written that civilians were surviving on 900. Children fainted in schoolhouses. Hospitals rationed soap. Yet here, in the land of the enemy, prisoners of war were fed like factory workers, given hot meals and meat, coffee and cigarettes. That night she shared the article with Helga and the others. They read it in stunned silence. One woman finally laughed bitterly. They spend billions on feeding us. Back home we spent everything feeding lies, Frau Müller answered quietly. It's the math of mercy. They fight with resources, not rage. The phrase hung heavy in the air. The math of mercy. It felt alien, yet undeniably true. Each plate of food, each bar of soap, each shower had been part of a machine far larger than anyone could see. The Americans hadn't just built tanks and planes. They had built decency into policy. The next day during her shift, she overheard a Texan sergeant talking to another guard. Funny thing, he said. We spend more keeping these POWs healthy than some towns spend on schools. They both laughed lightly and moved on, but the words hit Liesl harder than any insult. That night she wrote again in her journal. In Germany, they told us victory was science and steel. But here, victory is order, patience, fairness. They win by refusing to become like us. As the camp lights went out, Liesl stared into the darkness. The numbers ran through her head. Billions spent on kindness, thousands of calories, hundreds of prisoners, all of it adding up to a single impossible equation. A nation powerful enough to be merciful. She finally closed her eyes and whispered the sentence she knew would never leave her. They defeated us without a single insult, just food. By late summer, the Texas heat had settled over the camp like a heavy blanket. The women worked outdoors now, tending vegetable fields, mending uniforms, helping in the camp kitchen. It was hard labor, but it was labor under open skies, with wind, sunlight, and a strange new freedom inside the wire. One morning, a truck from a nearby ranch pulled up to the gate. Two cowboys climbed down, all boots, hats, and thick drawls. They'd come to pick up laborers for fence repair. And the sergeant assigned 6 German women to go with them. Liesl was one of them. The guards exchanged quick glances. Sending women outside the wire was unusual, but the rancher just tipped his hat. We'll take care of them. Promise. The drive was long, through fields of tall grass and red earth. The women stared out the back of the truck, silent, hands clutching their canteens. When they arrived, the rancher pointed to a wooden fence half collapsed by a storm. You fix it, we'll bring lunch. It was work, they knew. Hammering nails, tying posts. But here no one shouted. No overseers barked orders. The cowboys joked among themselves. Even teased one another about who could drive nails faster. One, named Earl, noticed Liesl struggling with a heavy beam. Without hesitation, he walked over, held it steady, and said, "There you go, ma'am." "Ma'am!" The word landed like a foreign song. No soldier in Germany had ever called her that. She nodded, unsure whether to thank him or keep her distance. He smiled anyway and stepped back. By noon, the sun was merciless. Sweat ran down their necks. Dirt caked under their nails. The smell of something cooking drifted from the truck, smoky, rich, mouth-watering. They turned to see Earl lifting a cast-iron pan from the tailgate. Inside, thick strips of bacon sizzled beside cornbread and beans. One woman muttered, "For us?" Earl grinned. "Y'all fixed my fence. Least I can do." They gathered around awkwardly, waiting for permission. Earl laughed. "Ain't no ceremony here. Dig in." The first bite stopped, Liesl cold. The flavor salty, warm, alive, hit harder than memory. She hadn't tasted real food in years. She set down the fork, eyes wet, unable to swallow for a moment. Around her, the other women ate slowly, glancing at one another in disbelief. When they finished, the rancher pulled out a harmonica and started playing a lazy tune. One cowboy clapped the beat. Another shouted, "Y'all ever dance in boots?" The women laughed, startled by the absurdity of it all. Liesl covered her face, shaking her head, but then she laughed too. For the first time since capture, the sound of joy echoed louder than fear. Back in camp that night, the guards noticed something different. The women moved lighter, spoke softer. One even hummed a tune. Helga whispered to Liesl as they lay awake, "I don't understand them. They fight like giants but live like neighbors." Frau Müller answered, her voice quiet in the dark. "Maybe that's why they win." Liesl couldn't sleep that night. The smell of bacon still clung to her clothes, and the sound of laughter from the ranch replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. She lay staring at the ceiling of the barracks, listening to the slow rhythm of breathing around her women, who for one afternoon had remembered how to smile. The next morning, during roll call, she found herself thinking not of fences or rations, but of arithmetic. The arithmetic of mercy. She had seen German officers punish soldiers for a broken salute, seen villages burned for defiance, and yet here in the enemy's land, a cowboy had handed her a plate of food. A country that spent billions to feed its enemies, to clothe them, to let them live in dignity. It didn't fit into any formula she'd been taught. Later that week, the camp received a Red Cross bulletin with printed statistics. The United States had spent over $1.8 billion to house Axis prisoners humanely, more than Germany spent feeding its own army in the same year. The number echoed in Liesl's mind. $1.8 billion. Not on bombs, but on decency. She read the sheet aloud to Helga. "They spent more feeding us than we spent keeping our soldiers alive," she said quietly. Helga didn't answer. She just stared at the ground, her face pale. "It's not just numbers," Liesl continued. "It's philosophy. They fight to destroy hate, not people." That sentence hit harder than she expected. Her own words left her uneasy, guilty even. For years she had believed Germany's propaganda, that compassion was weakness, that victory belonged to those who conquered, not those who cared. But now she saw the truth. Mercy could be an instrument sharper than any sword. That night, the camp chaplain, a quiet man from Oklahoma, visited their barracks. He spoke slowly through an interpreter about forgiveness, about strength and restraint. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest thing is to win without hate." Frau Müller couldn't look at him. The words burned too close. She thought of Berlin, of the hospitals, of the children she'd seen die for a cause she no longer believed in. The chaplain's voice softened. "Maybe that's why you're here. To see another way of fighting. Without killing?" She met his eyes for the first time. "Without losing your soul," he nodded. When he left, she stood at the window and stared into the night. The camp lights cast long shadows across the ground. The same earth that had once felt like a prison. Now it felt like something else. A place where her old beliefs were breaking apart, one quiet truth at a time. She whispered to herself, "They defeated us without a single insult, just food." The next morning, when the guards came to count the women, Liesl stood taller. Pride was still there. But it was no longer the kind she had been taught. It was something humbler, stronger, the kind born from being treated as human again. By autumn, the Texas air had cooled. The days grew shorter, and so did the silence inside the camp. The women now moved with a different rhythm, less guarded, more alive. They had learned enough English to exchange words with the guards, to ask for things politely, to laugh at jokes they barely understood. And once a month, they were allowed to write letters home. Each woman received a single sheet of paper, thin, cream-colored, stamped. It was meant to be a lifeline, but no one knew what to say. How could they explain that captivity had given them something they'd lost long before the war? Dignity. Liesl sat on her bunk, staring at the blank page. Finally, she began, "Dearest Mother, I am in a camp in Texas. It is warm here, and the people are strange. They work hard but smile often. They call me Miss Müller and give me coffee. We mend fences, pick vegetables, and even ride horses. The guards are young men, polite and curious. Yesterday one told me I reminded him of his sister. He said it kindly." She hesitated, then continued, "They feed us better than our soldiers ate. Sometimes there is meat, sometimes cake. I do not understand it. We were told Americans were savages, but they live by rules I can't explain. They do not fear us. They do not hate us. They simply go on living." She folded the letter and handed it to the camp clerk. That night, as she watched the envelopes pile up, she realized every letter told the same story in different words. The Americans treat us better than the Reich ever did. Weeks later, those letters began reaching Germany. Mothers, wives, and sisters read them in bombed-out kitchens and broken apartment blocks. The words spread quietly, whispered across bread lines and shelter basements. The war machine had promised victory. The prisoners were describing humanity. In a small town near Dresden, a widow read Liesl's letter aloud to her neighbors. They sat stunned. One woman whispered, "If this is defeat, perhaps it is mercy." Back in Texas, Liesl didn't know what her words had done. She only knew she felt lighter. The truth was traveling farther than any weapon she'd ever seen. One afternoon, she saw a guard reading a newspaper at the gate. The headline said the Allies were advancing into Germany. The guard looked up and met her eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he nodded once and said, "War's almost over, ma'am." "Maybe for you," she whispered, "but ours ended here." A few weeks later, the camp gates creaked open again, and a familiar pickup truck rolled in, dust curling up behind it like smoke. The same cowboy from the ranch, Earl, stepped down, hat in hand, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. The guards nodded. They remembered him. He'd come once before with bacon and beans. Now he was back with something else. Liesl and the other women were working in the garden, pulling weeds from long rows of squash. When they saw him walking toward them, every motion stopped. The sunlight hit the dust, and for a second, it looked like a scene out of a dream. The cowboy, the barbed wire, the women in gray dresses. He smiled the same easy way as before. "Afternoon, ladies," he said. "Didn't think I'd see y'all again." Frau Müller didn't know what to say. She wiped her hands on her skirt, nervous, cautious. The man held out the box. "Brought something from the ranch," he said. "My wife made it. Figured you might like a bit of sweet." Inside were small jars of homemade peach preserves. Sunlight caught in the glass. The women looked at each other, unsure whether they were even allowed to touch them. The cowboy noticed their hesitation. "Ain't no trick," he said softly. "War's nearly over. You folks just hang in there." Liesl reached out slowly, her fingers trembling, and took one of the jars. "Danke," she whispered. He tipped his hat. "You're welcome, ma'am." It was the first time she'd ever seen an American man speak to a German prisoner with such calm respect. No pity, no superiority, just simple decency. The women gathered around as he left, standing silent, watching the truck disappear into the sun. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, Helga said quietly, "He doesn't even see us as enemies anymore." Frau Müller shook her head. "No," she said. "He sees us as people." That night, the guards let them share the preserves after dinner. The taste, sweet, cold, honest, brought tears to several eyes. One woman murmured, "We burn cities and they bake for us." Liesl said nothing. She just sat there holding the empty jar in her hands. watching the way the camp lights reflected off the glass. The next morning, when the sun rose over the wire, she asked the sergeant if she could return the jar to the rancher. He nodded. When she handed it back, the cowboy smiled. "Keep it," he said. "Something to remember Texas by." She hesitated, then extended her hand. He shook it without a second thought. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched an American. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it was enough. Years later, she would write in her journal, "That day, I learned how peace begins, not with treaties, but with hands that choose to meet." By the spring of 1945, the Texas wind carried a different sound through the barbed wire. Fewer boots, fewer commands, more silence. The war in Europe was collapsing, and so were the old certainties that had once held Liesl's world together. Every morning she still lined up with the others for roll call, still wore the same gray uniform, but her heart felt unrecognizably lighter. Something inside her had shifted, not in a moment, but slowly through the rhythm of small kindnesses. A guard offering water on a hot day, a cowboy shaking her hand, a meal shared without fear. When the news finally came, "Germany has surrendered," there were no cheers in the camp, just stillness. Some women cried, others crossed themselves. A few stared blankly at the sky. Liesl simply closed her eyes. She thought of her home, of the father who'd sent her to war, believing she'd serve honor, of the lies she had once called truth. That night she opened her diary, a worn notebook she'd filled with memories of Texas. The barbecue, the laughter, the first taste of peach preserves. Her final entry read, "They called them cowboys. We called them fools. But it turns out the fools were us. They fought with humility. They treated us with dignity, and they won with grace. We were taught that strength means domination. America showed us that strength can also mean mercy." The barbecue, the jars of preserves, the quiet smiles, all of it had become a symbol of something she hadn't known she was starving for: humanity. Before being shipped home, Liesl walked one last time along the camp fence. The cowboy was there again, cleaning his saddle. He saw her, nodded, and said, "Guess y'all are going home soon." She smiled faintly. "Yes, but I think I'll leave something here." He raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "My hate." He said, "Nothing," just gave her a slow, respectful nod. When she boarded the transport truck the next day, she looked back at the camp, the dust, the sky, the faint sound of laughter drifting from the guards' quarters. It didn't look like a prison anymore. It looked like a crossroads, the place where the war in her heart had ended. Back in Germany, she would later tell her story in classrooms, to students who couldn't believe that America had fed, clothed, and even comforted its enemies. Her words carried the power of experience, not bitterness, but wonder. She always ended the same way. "They defeated us, without rage, without cruelty. And in doing so, they taught us what real victory means." Because the lesson of Texas wasn't written in bullets or surrender papers. It was written in acts of quiet mercy that outlasted the war itself. Mercy, the one weapon no army had ever truly mastered. The last train left Camp Hearn under a wide Texas sky. Dust lifted in soft clouds as the German women leaned from the windows, watching the barbed wire fade into the distance. The camp was silent again, except for the creak of wind through the empty guard towers. Liesl clutched the small glass jar the cowboy had told her to keep. Inside, a trace of dried fruit still clung to the rim. The last sweetness of a life she'd never expected to taste in captivity. She whispered quietly, "You defeated us with kindness." Across the fields, the sun was setting red, fierce, endless. The same light that had greeted her when she first stepped off the train months ago. But now it felt different. It no longer burned. It healed. Back home, she would tell her family that not all victors humiliate their enemies. Some simply outgrow them. The story of Texas would spread quietly through post-war Germany, whispered in kitchens, retold by those who had been there. The Americans didn't chain us, they fed us. That was the paradox of the war, that the truest power often appeared in gentleness. And long after the dust had settled, people would remember the simple scene. A cowboy in a hat, offering food to the defeated, proving that decency itself can break the strongest ideology. They mocked the cowboy, Frau Müller once said, but he fed them instead. History remembers wars for who won, but those who lived through this one remembered something deeper, that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones where no one falls.